The Greeks believed each of us comes into this life with like a guardian spirit that knows what we're meant to become. Depending on your disposition, it's trying to haunt you into becoming who the fuck you could be. We each have a call. This is what I believe, at least. Each of us have a call to basically become like a prophetic oracle when it comes to what fragment of the future mosaic is inside of us. And that to try to make contact with that and to try to bring that forth will be the hardest thing that you've ever done. And for better or for worse, the existential pressures of our time are sufficient where there's going to have to be a whole generation of heroic inner explorers.
Always just fiery pre-talk. You just hit me with that Godsey gravy in the last minute or two that got me so hyped up to start just to hit record, man. So always a pleasure.
Yeah, man, it's so good to be back. I love doing these podcasts with you.
Yeah, and by virtue of the fact that we've done so many and we've nerded out to such a deep level, there's always this like, how do I zoom it out into a way to start the conversation? But one of the things that obviously just runs through all of these conversations is Jung's archetype of individuation. Like what it means for a person to mature, not just psychologically, but psycho-spiritually.
Yeah.
And that gets into so many other things, obviously. But I had mentioned that there is this quote by Mary Louise von Franz, who, she's seen to be his probably closest confidant and coworker eventually. She helps him translate a bunch of stuff. But there's this quote she has about what Jung was really trying to communicate with his method and with individuation. And I thought I had read you this quote before, but maybe I haven't. And I thought it would be an interesting place to start.
Let's go.
Okay. The basis and substance of Jung's entire life and work do not lie in the traditions and religions which have become contents of the collective consciousness, but rather in that primordial experience, which is the source of these contents, the encounter of the single individual with his own god or daimon, his struggle with the emotions, effects, fantasies, and creative inspirations and obstacles which come to light from within. So that's from C.G. Jung, His Myth in Our Time.
Yeah, the thing that what I hear in that is that for better or for worse, the call of our times, because there isn't a collective coherent mythology, is we have to learn how to archaeologist our own inner mythology, and that we all have one, and this goes back to one of the quotes that people love to, share from Jung. And it's like, it's become a meme, but it's also like one of the most terrifying things Jung has ever said if you really grok it. And it's, until the unconscious is made conscious, it will control your life and you will call it fate. And it's like, to make the unconscious conscious is the task that, at least from my listening to that quote, that's what she is saying Jung was trying to tell all of us, which is no one can give it to you. Mm-hmm. You have to find it in you. Good luck. And I'm sorry.
You're right. Yeah. Yeah. And just to zoom in on a couple of parts of this quote, because I want to hear you riff on this.
Yeah.
So she specifically calls out that the answer is not in the traditions and religions because they have become part of the collective consciousness, but rather in the primordial experience, which is the source of those contents, which means the individual has to encounter his own god or daimon and struggle with the emotions, effects, and fantasies and creative inspirations, etc., which come to light from within. What does that mean? When you hear that, what does that mean?
Yeah. So for me, and again, take this with a fucking pound of salt, but this is what it feels like to me. And it's that the function of the capacity to dream is to navigate the future. It's to take the contents of the unconscious to generate new images to help life adapt to the tomorrow. And that if it has become absorbed in the collective unconscious, it's no longer connected to the oracle. like to the function in us that can precognate, that
Mhm.
can see the tomorrow. That when it's in the collective consciousness, it's basically like an artifact, it's sealed.
Yeah.
But each of us, like one of the functions of the thing in us that dreams is sometimes it tells the fucking future. Like,
Right.
what is going on there? Why is that even possible? And that I think, especially in our time, and like Jung lived through World War II. And I think it's really hard for us to grok what the fuck that must have felt like.
Yeah, I can't.
But that,
Knock
like,
on wood, hopefully we won't.
right, that the call is to step outside of the collective story, go within, so that we could potentially bring back to the collective a new image to
Mhm.
help us adapt to tomorrow. Because what we're facing as a collective, Jung's everyone who lived on the planet during Jung's time, 99% of them couldn't even imagine the existential problems that we're facing. And
Mhm.
that I think the call for the people who are willing to go there, and I think this goes to the Terence McKenna quote, like, if the artists cannot find the way
Mhm.
cannot be found. And what he was talking about in that quote is that artists are the people who are able to go into the unconscious and bring back new ideas. And just look around, guys.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
need new ideas.
Yeah. And let's not forget that Terence had a strong dose of Jung in him. He talks, I mean, there's that whole long address he gave to one of the Jungian societies. I don't
Yeah.
remember which one, where he's just, heaping praise on Jung. And, there's that quote about him saying, uh, he was like a psychological archaeologist scraping the detritus off of the world's mythologies and all of that stuff.
That's a good
Um,
impression. Yeah.
um, but why do you think so? I've been thinking about this. Why do you think she she doesn't say just the unconscious in this quote, right? I mean, and this is an authoritatively, like, for people that don't know, Mary Louise von Franz will sometimes do this thing where she will like authoritatively speak on Jung's thoughts on things because she worked so closely with him. Like, there was another one I just talked about with my friend MJ Dorian, where she talked about this time where Jung was talking or working with a group of people and they were talking about the shadow, and they were getting like overly masturbatory about kind of incarnating the shadow into this being. And he just very bluntly was like, the shadow is the unconscious, okay? Like, you're getting too literal. Like, the shadow is the unconscious. But she's not just talking about the unconscious here. She says, encounter your own personal god or daimon
Cool.
here.
Yeah.
Like, why do you
Yeah.
think she brings the daimon into this? And why do you think that's so important for her to say here?
Yep. Okay. So I think a important mature reading of Jung is there's two levels of reading Jung. There's the first level where you're reading what he wrote. The level two is you're studying what he did, how he lived. And, so there's the scientific work that Jung published, but then there's also the Red Book. And if you read the Red Book, what Jung did for, 4 or 5, I think up to like 9 or 10 years, he basically allowed himself to have what modern psychiatrists would probably call like a controlled psychosis or like a navigated psychosis, where he really let himself be taken in by, his unconscious characters. And that one of the things that he talks about and the Greeks talk about is there's this archetypal inner character who is a guide, who is a mentor,
Yeah.
who is trying to teach you things that you don't know. And if you just take a moment to think about the fact that there is something inside of you that can teach you things you don't know, that could sufficiently free your brain from the hallucination of rationality. But that the Greeks, believed that each of us comes into this life with a guardian angel. like a guardian spirit that knows what we're meant to become and is basically, depending on your disposition, it's trying to haunt you into becoming who the fuck you could be. And I think one of the profound things about Jung's life as a testament is maybe if we were brave, we would recognize that each of us, so the Greek word is eudaimonic, which is like big soul or great soul. And it's like we each have a call. This is what I believe, at least. Each of us have a call to basically become like a prophetic oracle when it comes to what fragment, what shard of the future mosaic is inside of us. And that to try to make contact with that and to try to bring that forth will be the hardest thing that you've ever done. You will think that you're going crazy. We don't have elders in our culture to guide people into this process. And for better or for worse, the existential pressures of our time are sufficient where there's going to have to be a whole generation of heroic inner explorers who are going to have to learn how to do this on their own or to do it in tandem, with a couple of close friends. But to get back to the core of your question, I think the reason she emphasizes your personal God slash your personal daemon is that what Jung talked about, this idea, the imago Dei, which is your inner image of God. It's really hard to appreciate, but whatever, anyone who's listening to this, whatever your inner capacity to hold the feeling tone and the image of the Most High, it's not God. It's your imago Dei.
Right.
And if you listen to Jung and you listen to Marie, that thing is trying to have a conversation with you. So I think like one of the things that's a really good piece of advice for people who are going to do ayahuasca for the first time is it's not about you just fucking surrender and you let it tell you things. That the mature way to interact with it is you dance with it, you wrestle with God. Most people do not want to accept the immensity of the fact that that thing, that Most High, is not a thing that you just placate yourself to. That thing is trying to yoke you and is trying to wrestle with you.
Wow.
And I think that is like, it's terrifying to consider that might actually be the door that we're all trying to get brave enough to go into.
Yeah. Pardon my teleportation, friends, quickly dropping in to remind you to please tickle that algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. Though there was no formal introduction this week, it really is of the utmost importance. Also, we've got hundreds of mind melds that are audio only, so do sub to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you want to not only support, but join in more on these Wonder Dips, rap with me and dozens of other curious kin, get in on a patron-only book club, Discord server, Zoom hangs, get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more, then come commune with us at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. I would love to have you. And now back to the transmission. Yeah, that's crazy, man. Like that idea, that part, like you can't go through the motions of just like spreading your legs for the Mysterium Tremendum and being like, just take me, I'm ready. It's like, no, the ego death is fucking part of it. You have like, whether you are willing to wrestle with it or not, like that whole death experience of the ego is massively important to learn the lesson. Like there's no going through the motions of it. Like you must get shredded. You absolutely must get shredded in those experiences. And I want to zoom out a little bit into this metaphysical picture because this is so individual. And if you really settle into this sort of a mind space, this idea that there's only one way and it's your way, or that other overused quote of Jung's, if you
if the path is clear, it is
oh
not.
yeah, if the path before you is clear, then you're probably on someone else's. which I don't even know if that's
I think it's Campbell.
legit his or not. But yeah, that thing that you said too about the Imago Dei, that reminds me, speaking of Campbell, that quote about, that we've definitely talked about before, this idea that you've got to kill your image of God
Yep.
to get to God, to the
Yep.
real God. And that all folds back into this central concept, which is it feels incredibly lonely if this is something you all have to do on your own, and that it feels like, there's no, like, even worse now, because to your point, there are really no elders, or far too few, that really can guide us through this process, though they are out there, but there's just fewer of them and they're harder to find. But if you take the admittedly gargantuan step of seriously taking the idea seriously, that although maybe your physical and psycho-spiritual mission is a solitary one, it's in the context of this panoply of forces and
Yeah.
spirituality and divinity. I mean, that's what all of these cultures believed. The Greeks, to your point, where this myth comes from, believed that you don't just have a daimon because that's the way it is. You have a daimon because your soul, quote unquote, chose it during this intermediate stage of living and dying. And don't misconstrue this as like, I chose everything and I'm here just because to have it. That's not exactly right either.
For sure.
It's what it is there's a if you're lucky enough to be in a sort of mode of personal evolution where you have some consciousness and ability to understand what your soul needs to work on, um or do to like continue trying to perfect it, then there's like this conscious process of this thing needs to get worked out. There's this whole like collective archetypal thing needs to be worked out. And it's like the level to which I can't communicate what I'm about to say because it's so brain breakingly massive. But it's this idea that your body, everything you think you are, is merely a very cheap manifestation or figurehead of something ancient, immortal, non-local, like hyper cosmic, but nonetheless your body is a thing that thing is doing right now. And
Yeah.
there's a specific set of circumstances that are far too large to even begin to try to understand, but I don't think are illogical. Like I think,
For sure.
and I do think that when we're in states like with ayahuasca, deep in meditation, altered in other ways, we start to see the complexity of
Yeah.
everything that's going on. And then if you take that view of what she's saying here, that your encounter with your own god or daimon really is like you're touching the connecting point between you and infinity, and the thing that's there holding your rope, so to speak, or holding your, the picture of like the 4D or 5D picture of like, remember, this is what you're here for, is this whole
Yeah.
thing that
Yeah.
exists in some sort of, you know non-Euclidean, non-local quantum. I'll just throw all of the buzzy woo words out there because there is no word for this.
Yeah.
Actually, there is. There is a word, logoi. Have we talked about logoi before?
No.
Dude, okay. So here's another just concept that's really hard to try to explain that I first came across, or really went to the trouble of trying to understand when I did my Plato's Cave video, because one of these Neoplatonic thinkers talks about this idea that as you start actually going through these steps of leaving Plato's cave, essentially, where you are entering the intelligible realm, you're getting out of the cave of the physical world, the physical body, and your mind is becoming more and more refined, and you're able to start seeing these levels of reality that only exist in the intelligible, in this uh, noetic realm, you start to come across these things that are essentially like intermediate forms. So it's sort of like, imagine a form that's like way outside of space and time, um, an archetypal. It's so hard to try to explain this shit, but like
Yeah,
let's think about a number or something, right? Like Pythagoreans believed that there is one, not like the one we write down, but there is like a number one archetype concept that exists in a way that transcends space and time. And that's why one in this dimension is a concept, right?
right.
Because it's something that is actually true, and you can't disprove through any kind of contortion of
For sure.
math, science, whatever. So now imagine that's actually what the universe is made out of, basically, and it's projecting itself down into more and more kind of attenuated forms until you get down here on Earth. And now imagine though that you to some degree can start to contact that world through intermediate forms.
For sure.
That's like what a logoi is. So there are like these logoi of your soul that you can start to connect to, or like consciously become aware of, is a better way to put it.
The first thing that came up that stood out is that feeling of loneliness of starting to encounter your personal God. I want to offer a couple of things. One, that if you understand, if you allow the giggle of Jung's entire body of work to land in you, you will recognize that it is the opposite of being alone. That those things inside of you, they're real. They're a different category of real. Like it's not it's not a marker of someone's wisdom to be able to make fun of people who use the word real for their subjective experiences. It's actually a mark of intelligence to be able to recognize that there is a domain of life that consciousness functions within, that is space-time, and that like the laws of physics reign supreme. But it's also a part of just being a mature adult who's not disconnected from their soul, to recognize that you can have physiological trauma trapped in your soma for 10 years, and then you can have a vision that's entirely internal that can heal the trauma. And all you got to do is study trauma to see that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of case studies of people having dreams, or people having non-ordinary states of consciousness visions where they complete some type of act, where they do something heroic. And the space-time measurable chronic stress response that they've had for 10 years, and their sleep apnea and their like panic attacks, they go away.
Wow.
And that's because the subjective life is real too, doofus. And I'm talking to me 5 years ago. It's like,
Right.
dude, subjective experiences, especially dreamlike experiences, have a type of reality to them. And you can't grok Jung until you recognize that this internal exploration, it is the opposite of being lonely. Your dream life, like for me, the dreamer is a companion. I never feel alone. And that might sound like an exaggeration, but it's not. I know my subjective experience, and that the dreamer is almost like a gateway drug to your internal family. That's how
Wow.
I see it. And it's like I have a cast of characters in me, like 8 so far, that I've interacted with enough where they're inside of the room with me. But there's an infinite amount yet to have been connected to parts in my shadow, in my unconscious. And that it is one of the great fun adventures of my life, that when some new force knocks on the wall of my inner castle, I'm going to let that motherfucker in. I'm going to talk to it.
Yeah.
And it's delicious because it's a it's a dimension of life that is never exhausted of its adventure, and that anything that you let in from the shadow that you start to work with, that you integrate, they all bring a gift. They all bring some type of new power. So I want to offer that. But also at the same time, there's a very cool idea that I've heard Churchill talk about where he's like, for the people who have gone through the journey into soul and to make contact with your inner God, if you will, once that happens, you then acquire a type of sight that you didn't have before, where you can recognize the other people who have done that.
Mm.
And he talks like there's almost like a invisible college of graduates, and it's not organized,
Mm-hmm.
but you just recognize, oh, that person walks around with their soul with them.
Right.
You know, and that their soul is like, at least the way it feels to me, is that now that I have the type of relationship that I have to the thing that I would call my daemon, I don't get to choose where I go. I could, but that thing will, hiss. That thing guides me, and I actually move on its behalf. And I think it's an entirely different orientation that comes from like once you make contact with that thing, and it's like if and when we make contact with that thing in us, it's the task of our life to stop being a fucking complaining clod of grievances and ailments, and to actually start to yoke ourselves into being worthy of something that can talk to a God, you know?
Dude, that's a really great way to put it. That last bit there. Making yourself worthy to talk to a god. And this book, dude, Theurgy and the Soul by the fucking great Dr. Gregory Shaw. Um, in a nutshell, that is what it's talking about. How do you make yourself worthy to talk to a god, to commune with a god, to draw down divinity into you? And in the mythopoetic, it's not even mythopoetic terminology. That's one thing in the ancient world that we got to like get our mind around is like when they're talking about gods and daimones, and it's not mythopoetic. It's not like a psychological idea. It is you live in a world of like nested ecosystems, and at a certain point, those ecosystems become spiritual or noetic ecosystems.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a somatic knowing, but because we're so amputated, we have to use these bridge words for people.
right, right. But that's but like when you, so I've read this entire book, and there's it's one of those books where it's dense. There's a lot of terminology, but the feeling that you leave with is that not only do you have to take the idea, well first of all, profound sadness because we definitely have lost a lot of the praxis of like the practical elements of
Yeah.
what is being done, what are the objects being used, how, like what specifically, how do you do this stuff? Because I know there's inevitably going to be those people who are like, we didn't lose anything. I disagree, but anyway, um
We lost the instructions, but
yes,
not the truths. They can still be found, but now we have to fucking blunder and walk over territory that was previously explored, and they even made roads, but the roads are
right,
gone, the lights are
yeah,
gone, and it's like, who wants to go into the dark forest and tell us how to do it?
right. And to your point, it was like you can tell like Iamblichus, the Neoplatonic sage who is primarily referenced throughout this book, he's such an interesting case because he's talking from the perspective of Greek Platonism, from the perspective of Egyptian magic, because he calls himself a Egyptian priest in here. He's also
What
Assyrian.
year is he?
He's
Like, what's a rough time?
about I think late 200s to 300s AD.
Cool.
Um, so so anyway, he's talking from this Chaldean. So he's I mean his primary work is like on the mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and I think there's one other, maybe it's Assyrians, I forget the name, but that's like the primary work of Iamblichus. He's talking about this ecology of mystical traditions that he has been initiated into and knows the ways of. And theurgy, this primary practice that he and then all of the Neoplatonists after him become obsessed with, is this practice of how do you perfect your soul to the degree where you can make it so divinity comes down to you, presents itself to you, and works through you.
Yeah.
It's profoundly ego annihilating and unselfish. It's completely about
Yeah.
prostrating yourself and attracting divinity to work through you. And the daimon comes into play here specifically. Like it says basically the very like the first big step in this is to make that connection with your personal daimon. It will appear to you, it will tell you how to address it, it will tell you how to evoke it. It is not a metaphor. Like it is this is a spirit that is like in you, attached to you. And then once you create this relationship with that thing and your whole life becomes about working with it, eventually, he says, the rarest of rare souls then get the opportunity to go from having a daimon to a god. And that makes a lot of sense, because there's this whole really fun piece of lore about the major Neoplatonist thinker who comes before him, Plotinus, where he goes to this temple of Isis. And I may have told you this story before, but it's a fun one. And the priest basically says, I can make your daimon appear. And he says, okay, great, let's do it. So he does whatever he needs to do to make the daimon appear, and a god way too great for a normal individual comes into the temple, and people freak out basically because it's just this enormously divine presence that overwhelms everybody. So that may be what he was referring to there, but yeah, I mean, it's profoundly not metaphorical in this case, yet it maps perfectly onto Jung's individuation, don't you think? Like this journey from thinking of yourself only as this ego, this thing interfacing with the world, to going through what Jung would call the unconscious and getting to this pure, unadulterated capital S self that is the essence of who you are. Like
Yeah.
that to me sounds indistinguishably similar.
So I need to check out this book, because the idea that you just casually walked by, but that I would love for you to tell me more about, is that the daemon can evolve into a god. So can
Yeah.
you
Do
like
you want me to just read this part?
describe? Well, yes, but I want to like lay the question and see if like there's also a distillation that comes through you. But it's
Mhm.
that, what is the difference between the two? What is the like act of transformation? How do you discern if the transformation has happened? Because I literally have never even considered that my daemon can evolve into a new
Right.
tier of thing.
Yeah. Man, I don't know. I would be humongously speculating, and I am deeply aware of how unperfected and just
Oh, and real
much
quick,
much more. Yeah.
yeah, I want to offer, instead of perfected, I think it's kinder to ourselves and more true to say just cultivate it. For to cultivate our relationship to it to the point where we can basically start to
Hmm.
talk to it. Because I don't think that there's a perfection, but I think cultivation is like, if we look to nature, like one of the compassionate gifts of nature is you cultivate
Hmm.
something so that it can become, and that you get infinite chances because of seasons. And so, instead of like perfection kind of feels like I'm working with granite or marble or something.
Well, yeah, it's perfect that you say this because sorry to interrupt you, but that was what I was thinking when I said that. Is Plotinus has that thing about if you find yourself still to he uses that whole statue metaphor of like shaping the statue of the self, like just continue chiseling, continue polishing, continue perfecting. And that's what he's talking about. He's not talking about your your business or whatever. He's talking about your soul
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. And just for what it's worth, I think a more accurate metaphor, if I could be so audacious, is to think of nature and plants and
Mhm.
trees and such. So yeah, but yeah. So I would love to hear you riff on like, what the fuck is this evolution of the daemon into a new thing?
So what I think it is so we've got to take this whole metaphysical situation seriously just for a second here. This idea that for people that don't know, I'm not even going to go into the myth of Ur, but there's this whole myth from Plato's Republic where someone is having a near death experience. They see this process of
How
how
dare
a
you? They die for 11 days. How
right,
dare you?
right, yeah, right. Um, they basically select a lot which is linked to a destiny. They select the daimon and then they descend into their physical body, and that is the essentially the situation here that you have selected a daimon and a fate, and that's what's going on with you being here on Earth. So what he's saying, I think, is that you can transcend the sort of lot and mission that you've been given somehow. And then once you do that, you're working on with like a higher order of being now. Like you're working with something else that like because if you think about what a daimon is, it's always every daimon has a job basically. And this starts to get into the like more like Western esoteric and even like magical side of things. Like daimons are essentially spirits that are within the purview of a higher being, a higher noetic being, and then those daimons go do a job given by the higher being. And so that's true of your own daimon too. Like your daimon is in a chain that ascends upwards. So if you can exhaust the job of that thing. Now it's like corporate, I guess. It's like now you went up to like the middle management or whatever. Um, that's really what's being presented here, and that's essentially what's being said in this book. Is that um, I was reading this earlier, so it's right here, but I could read the long version or the short version. But basically, so there's a quote directly from Iamblichus, and then Professor Shaw sums it up in saying, this was a privilege reserved for very few souls. The great majority were best served simply by fulfilling the dictates of their guardian daimon. It should be noted that despite Iamblichus's occasional references to evil daimones, there is no evil daimon competing for control of the soul. Iamblichus explicitly states that the soul has only one ruling daimon and that he is good. To fulfill the charges of this guardian, however, the soul first had to recognize him, then develop a rapport. Recognition of that daimon was not gained by artificial means or by human effort, but was given directly and theurgically by the Lord of daimons. And it's wordy. It keeps going,
It's
but
cool. I love it.
basically, what he says is that in extremely rare cases of like the most enlightened people, basically, they could transcend their individual mission and start. I mean, it's hard not to look at somebody like a Jung and think like that's what it looks like when a something way more than normal human starts to come through, like somebody who really like shifts a paradigm or introduces a completely new philosophy that alters the fabric of the psychic fabric of the world or something
Yeah.
like that. I don't know, it's hard to speculate.
In that book, is there any description of what the like phenomenological experience would be of that transformation?
I don't think on that part exactly. There are some allusions to like divine visions that do accompany this theurgic practice. Um, but it's he's always very careful. He speaks very authoritatively, like he knows exactly like what he's
Sure.
talking about. But is no, not Shaw. Iamblichus,
Cool. Yeah.
this guy. Um, he talks about visions of light. He talks about visions of figures and stuff like that. But specifically on this daimon thing, I don't think it's mentioned particularly how that appears, unless I'm forgetting. But I do now eventually want to go back and read his primary writings more closely. What's funny is I came across Day Mysteries or On the Mysteries way before I had the context to even try to read it or understand who Iamblichus is or how he
That's
fits
cool.
into all of this stuff. But I read some of it and I was just kind of like, oh, he talks about this thing here that I know, but a lot of
Right.
it was just going right over my head. I don't know,
Yeah.
but it certainly evokes that kind of a just yearning for a past that may have never existed in me.
That's such an awesome way to put it. Yeah. So the thing that comes to mind is that like the core intent, I think, of like my class, it feels weird to say my teaching, but it is what it is. And it's to get people to acknowledge that they have a daemon or a daimon. And the two pieces, or really the three pieces of advice I give everybody is: step one, cultivate a practice of telling yourself the truth. And that if you adequately understand what the fuck that means, it's the most terrifying thing that the person who is starting out can start to do. Because when I started to practice telling myself the truth, I think I was 22 or 23. My first major relationship was coming to an end. She was going to move out the next day. I had a back spasm that was so bad that I couldn't walk for 5 days. And so on the last day that she lived with me, she had to bring me a cup to piss in. That's
Wow.
how low it got. And then when she moved out, I was listening to a podcast by Tim Ferriss, and he mentioned the book, The Artist's Way. And I just felt, in hindsight, it was my whisper, but I didn't have the context then. But I just felt this overwhelming sense to order the book. And then because of the magic of Amazon, it came to my house in 2 days. So it was day 3 of my 5 days of not lit. I couldn't stand. I couldn't walk. I
Wow.
get this book. I started to read it and I had this overwhelming like spiritual feeling. And when I was 22, 23, this was a foreign experience to me somatically. But I felt compelled that if I read this book like it was the Bible, that it would help me. And so I approached it like it was the Bible. And the first chapter of that book is, it says to start writing the daily pages. And the daily pages are where you write by hand 3 pages, stream of consciousness, where you're just trying to tell yourself the truth. And so I picked up, or I crawled to a journal that I had and I started writing. And within 2 days, I started walking again. And for the next 3 months, I wrote by hand 3 pages, and this notebook had small lines. And so it took almost an hour every day. Within a month, I realized that I had fallen out of love with my partner for at least a year and a half, but I was too much of a coward to admit it to myself. And I had hurt her deeply because I was such a coward. 2, I didn't like any of my friends, and not because my friends weren't good people, but because I was so ashamed of who I was. I didn't let any of them actually know me, and so I felt alone in all of my friendships. And 3, I realized that I hated and was terrified of my body. And
Hmm.
those were life-changing insights that were things I already knew deep down, but I never developed a practice of telling myself the truth. It was through reading this book that I found Jung and I started to learn about my dreams. Like, it happened as I was reading the daily, or the Artist's Way, and I was doing the daily pages. It was like halfway through when I found Man and His Symbols, and I
Mhm.
started to read it, and I started to have my first dreams that I like cherished and that I cared about and that I started to have a relationship with. And so that was the like start. And then fast forward like 3 years, and I've told this story, but I accidentally ate 180 milligrams of THC,
Yeah,
blah, blah, blah.
that's insane.
After that experience, my takeaway was nothing is going to be harder than what I experienced last night. So whenever I feel the call from my soul to do something and it scares me, I have to do it. Not I have to, I just will, because it won't be worse than what happened. And literally within 6 days, I got my dream job at On It. And I moved and, it started this whole journey. And then step 3, so I tell people, start to tell yourself the truth. 2, start to cultivate the instinct to just do the shit that you're afraid to do. And 3, make art that you actually put out in front of people. And for what it's worth, that seems to be sufficient to get people properly inside of the gravitational well of their inner whisper, that the joke is by the end of the class, it's like, if I told you guys the truth when I marketed this class to you, it'd be like, hey, come take this class and I'll fuck up your life and you'll love it. And by the end of the class, that's what most people report, because it's like, the truth is, at least for me, the people who are drawn to what I talk about, they know what they need to do, but they pretend like they don't. And like by the end of the class, like one of the people realized, you'd be so surprised how many people, what they actually need to do is they have to confess that they cheated on their partner, or they have to, or they have to get a divorce, or they have to leave the job. And that it takes, 13 weeks of, me talking about all this other shit for them to get to the point where they're like, oh, fuck you, Eric, but thank you. Because I know exactly what I need to do. And so does anything else come up for you as like practical takeaways for people? 1, tell the truth. 2, do things you're afraid to do. 3, make art.
Yeah, I think this is a really important thing to try to attempt to zoom in on, because it's one of the most nebulous things, but I know exactly what you're talking about. And I think a lot of people know exactly what you're talking about. Kind of, which is you said that there was something in you that you now know is the quote unquote whisper.
Yeah.
That when you heard about The Artist's Way, something in you clicked and you were like, I just need this book.
I was seized.
Yeah.
It seized me.
Zoom in on that, because that's one of those things now where I can look back at my attraction to some of these ideas and it's utterly confounding. Like I told you, I came across On the Mysteries by Iamblichus like 5 years ago or something, or 6 years. I don't remember when it was exactly. And it was just like, ooh. But then I started reading it and I'm just like, there's too much out of context. But there was something in me, even at that time, that thought it was important or thought it was interesting.
Yeah.
And there's so many things in my life like that are just, you don't know why you have this strange attraction to them.
Yeah. So it's really interesting, but it feels like it is it feels like there's 2 types of things that can seize us. One is the whisper. And I think it has to do with if we have like contact with the innocence of childhood play, like it's completely non-attachment style, wounded, informed. It's just, this caught my eye. But then there's the other type of thing that will seize us, and it's all of our trauma. It's our attachment wounds. So there's a certain type of person who just can't help but be attracted to this certain type of partner that will basically abuse them again. That's not the whisper. That's the like attachment pain. There's something about the quality of the contact with the whisper, at least for me, that feels like it feels like when you're walking at night through like a vast plain, like I imagine Montana for some reason, I don't know why, when lightning cuts through the sky deep in the horizon, and for a moment the entire hundreds of miles worth of land just reveals itself to you in a moment.
Dude.
That quality is what it feels like, as opposed to the attachment wounds have this felt sense of like, it's almost like from the groin,
Ooh.
that like it's either like a pull towards or a push away from something like in that like 1 to 2 chakra root area,
Yeah, dude.
where at least for me, the daemon is not flashing lightning on those lower chakras. It doesn't mean that what you're attracted to is not like okay and healthy from when it comes to that. But if you think that your big insight is true, good, and beautiful, but it kind of makes your dick hard, it's probably an attachment wound. You're probably trying to play something out that you are, bullshitting yourself. At least
Yeah.
that's what it's like with me. But
Dude, have you seen that clip of Mike Tyson when you said that? Where that clip of Mike Tyson, he's being interviewed and he's talking about how the violence, I got erected. It made my dick hard. Have you seen that?
I haven't, but I
Oh my
fucking
god,
please send me
it's
that clip.
that as soon as you said that, I thought about that. But yeah,
Dude.
yeah.
So just real quick, I think Mike Tyson, to me, he's one of the most honest humans that I've ever seen who has touched some of those archetypical places
Oh yeah,
because he's got no shame.
dude.
And so people with no shame, they can still do bad things. And that's almost like a hallmark of not having shame. But they'll tell you the truth of what it feels like. And I think that there's something deeply wise in that clip
Yeah,
where
yeah,
he's like, it made my dick hard. Like it made me erect, and I think one of the things that's, one of the things that's so interesting is like when it comes to the individuation process, the three main like blockages that most Jungians talk about modern people have to alchemize in order for them to really make contact with who they could be is one, you have to admit to yourself that you want to fuck and that you want to be fucked, not just by your partner. Two, you have to be able to admit to yourself that there's a part of you that wants to fucking dominate other people.
yeah,
And three, there is a part of you that wants to be the best. It
yeah.
wants to be worshiped. It wants to be seen and deferred to. And that we all have those in us. And that if those things can be integrated, we basically become a more whole, competent human. And if
Right.
those things stay in the shadow, it'll control your life and you'll call it fate.
So true, man. Yeah, it's just so funny to me how you were talking about the pull that comes from like the as you said the lower chakras, and that's like exactly what Plato describes and when he talks about the tripartite soul and he talks about that lower, bodily, animalistic, sexual, desire based part of the soul as eros and like equates it with that lower region of the body. And it's not that that's wrong,
It's not.
but
It's not bad.
what it is that is your connection to this world. That's what makes you look at things, desire things, want to dominate things.
It's also what
And
keeps
it's
you alive. Like your will to
right,
live comes from there.
right, but then this is where that, that famous chariot allegory comes in where it's like control that horse, baby. That horse, you need that horse, but control it. Don't let that horse control you because if you get controlled by that horse, you're not doing theurgy. Like you're doing the opposite of theurgy. Like you're stuck in worldly, possession-based, ego-based, emotion-based games rather than I mean, in strictly platonic terms, what is true and beautiful are the immortal things, not the things like the thing that you think is beautiful in the world right now will be rotten and decaying in 50 years, right?
I think the thing that's
What are the things that don't rot and decay? Like
yeah,
that's where the mind needs to learn to live in platonic terms, at
yeah.
least.
And like so I can hear Caitlin in my head because she would argue with this and she argues with me. Like we actually had an argument about Eros and the chariot metaphor a couple of days ago. And
Well,
this is
let's
how
rehash it. Let's rehash
yeah,
it
yeah,
because
yeah.
I'm interested. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think her disposition would be that, like, we have enough sexual repression in our
Mhm.
world already, and that
Mhm.
most people will interpret this as another justification for the echo of Catholic Christianity as a way to negate, the fact that you have a dick and that you have
Mhm.
a vagina and that they want things. I think her thing is the poet, the part of us that can look at the death and can love the death and that can appreciate the death and that can, like, she it was so cool. She's been working on completing her first book of poetry, and it's been like the
Mhm.
hardest thing that she's ever done. And she's been, in front of her computer more than she would like to have been for the last like 2.5 months. But yesterday she took a day off and she like went out into town and got like a massage and like went and shopped and just like, really.
Mhm.
And when she came home, she was describing to me what it was like. And I could feel myself drop in where she was like describing what it smells like to walk into a nice hotel. She
Mhm.
was describing how she missed being sweaty with her friends at brunch, in the hot Austin heat in the
Mhm.
summer, where they're just laughing and drinking wine. That's like the lower chakra type thing. But the thing that she, I think, is an advocate for is like, tell that story like a poet,
Mhm.
like smell the smells, taste the tastes. And I think that the bridge between these two things is that the average person in our culture, they're two in their head already. And they're just completely disconnected from having a conscious, sensual connection to their body. And that, like, really one of the tasks of our times is to get back into our body, because our body is a extension of Gaia Sophia, in my opinion, and that the
Mhm.
intelligence of the planet, like, if we talk about, like the eternal patterns as up, the primal mother is down, and we're dysfunctionally disconnected from that part. And she's working with this map where there's 6 levels of pleasure, and she's trying to, and this comes from one of her teachers, Mark Gaffney, and is trying to basically talk about the lowest level of pleasure is that animal pleasure of like
Right.
the food, I want to fuck the things.
Mhm. Mhm.
Level 2 is the pleasure of relationships,
Mhm.
of being in community, of having people that you love and that you care for. Stage 3 is the pleasure of having something that you stand for. So it's the pleasure of like believing in something deeply. Stage 4 is the pleasure of true knowledge, of actually apprehending what we would, call like a platonic form. Like it's inherently pleasurable, actually.
Mhm. Mhm.
The fifth one is the pleasure of the interconnectedness of all things. And then stage 6 is the pleasure of your unique self, of actually, once you move through all those first 5 stages, is to recognize that you still have a personal taste
Mhm.
that is your unique offering to the infinite evolutionary unfolding of, the story of God.
I'm just laughing because at the end, I think you just kind of brought it all. You like connected the circle, like between the two ideas.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, and that's exactly what I like. You just restated in a different way what I was going to say is that there is no in the way that we view all of this now, in this puritanical, religiously wounded way, where eros has been like completely just pushed down, and
Yeah.
like we pretend like we don't have attractions to things, and we um just completely try to absolve ourself of that's not the Greek milieu this is coming out of. Like, if anything, people were very probably much more libertine back then. So I think they had probably the opposite problem where it needed to be reined in because
Exactly.
everybody
Exactly.
was sort of in that mindset where you could probably go to orgies, you could probably do whatever you want, like pretty much whenever if you had the means to do so. but that's not where we're coming from. So I think we have the problem of seeing it from the opposite perspective. And
That's a
then you
great point.
read, yeah, and then you read Plato's Symposium, and it's essentially what that teaching of Gaffney that you were just saying, where there's the sort of bodily physical eros, but what eros really is, and this gets into this whole speech where Socrates recounts what he learned from this wise woman named Diotima, and she's this priestess who explains to him that what eros really is the interconnecting web of love and philos and eros that exists throughout all things. It's this
Amen.
immortal connection um,
Yeah.
that you can learn to see. And seeing that immortal connection is like you can see that in an individual and it makes them beautiful forever. Whereas, if you're just obsessed with that person because they have a nice ass or whatever, that's something that is going to probably the second you get it, you won't be interested anymore, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like there's something very transactional, situational, and base, even though it's like it is fitting some divine proportion or something, right? If you got right down to it, just slap one of those
It's so funny.
God, how am I forget?
Fibonacci
Yeah,
sequence.
yeah. Slap the Fibonacci sequence over it, fits perfectly type thing.
That's
Um,
hilarious.
but it's like, well, yeah, because it's the Fibonacci sequence that you're really attracted to. But anyway,
That's
but yeah,
awesome.
man, I don't think I need to say anything else because you perfectly summed it up right there.
Yeah. And so I think to get back to, does anything come up for you as things that you have found have facilitated your relationship to your whisper, other than to tell the truth, do things you're afraid to do, make art?
I feel like there's a part of me that feels kind of asymmetric because I feel like I've done some things where I'm like, yes, I think I'm on the path. Like as cliche as it sounds, and as maybe not important to some people as it sounds, to your point, quitting my day job, believing I could go into this full time, that absolutely feels like something. But
For
then
sure.
there are still parts of myself that scare me. There are still things in my life that I feel are not harmonizing. And part of me is like, well, of course, because that's life is just inherently always going to be sloppy and just,
For sure.
you can't manicure things to be perfect. There is no perfect. As long as you're in this really complex situation of physical things moving around, bumping into each other. Um, but also, I mean, I am so deeply aware of the fact that there's like so much more work to do, so much more polishing of the proverbial statue to do. But I do think that there is a sort of trust that you've got to find in yourself. And it's not, it's supremely important to divorce that trust from and that intuition from your bias. Like we've had this conversation so many times of like how biased, like you can say that your intuition is really just your bias, right? Or your bias is whatever. Like it's like I just think I should quit my job because it sounds great. Like of course it sounds great because jobs suck. But it's not always that simple. It's following that whisper is not the thing that feels good all the time. It's very complicated, and there are if, ands, and buts, I think, that come along with all of this by virtue of the fact that it is individual. But I do think at a certain point, I think the very first level of like learning that language and doing that thing that makes it prevent itself, I think it's like the sub, like let's imagine there is actually a level where it's not metaphorical and the thing is right there in front of you and you're hanging out and you're talking in some language that only you have. Let's just pretend that that's the highest level of this. What it's like first is some nebulous thing, something that you just kind of sense that you see it like that. I wanted to say this before. Your metaphor about the lightning flashing is absolutely perfect. And Jeffrey Kripal, the legendary professor, uses a very similar metaphor in his book. I think it's either his newest book or it's the book The Flip. But he talks about this moment of like lightning flashing, like a higher level of truth just sort of making itself apparent to you for a moment in a very
Yeah.
undeniable kind of way, like an anamnesis kind of way, like
Yeah.
platonically speaking, where it's just like boom, like it's just a known thing that overtakes you somehow. But I think it's more like this very faint light off in the distance that you kind of just, something in you knows like that this is true north and this is the general direction, and you're constantly just skewing off course and course correcting, skewing off course and course correcting, and just fucking up, and then other things are interfering with your ability to chase that because that's just how life is. But that's that soul, that's that paradigma, that's that paradigm, that's the glint of the thing the daimon is holding off in the distance that you're going toward. And it just is this nebulous maze like thing that you're kind of traversing and kind of not all the time. And you only know, I really think, in hindsight and looking back and like, wow, I've come a long way in the last year, last 5 years, last 10 years. And you kind of know how much you've either ignored the path or you've embraced the path, I think. Because I think that I would never presume to sit a person down and be like, tell me all the ways you fucked up, man, because I can tell you just really fucked up and you're way off the, like, I would never do that. But at the
Yeah.
same time, like, we all have friends, we all have loved ones that you watch their dreams or their something shrink away, and they just decided like, nah, like just basically some version of tapping out. And so there's that on that extreme. And then there's the other extreme of like, I will burn my life down for this thing because nothing else will feel satisfying. Nothing else will make me eudaimonic. So I'm going to push that boulder, man, no matter how bad it hurts, no matter if my like feet start ripping, to stretch the metaphor. I'm going to keep pushing and keep pushing because there's nothing else to do that matters. And I think that there's like a very few people get to either extreme completely, I think.
I mean, I think
But
a lot of people are at the tapping out extreme.
I think so too, unfortunately. What do you think so here's a just giant irresponsible question.
Love it.
What do you think the cost to the world is by so many people choosing to tap out, or choosing to just take the easy route, or choosing to like stay in the job because it pays well, choosing to buy a car that's too expensive and then forcing themselves in a situation, all those things?
35 million people dying a year from diseases of civilization, 400 million people being diagnosed as depressed. Like 90% of the species that were alive on this planet when we were born are now extinct. Children are burning because of bombs being dropped on different places in the Middle East. World War III might happen in our lifetime, and we might extinct ourselves.
That's it. So yeah, I don't disagree at all. But let's zoom in a little bit for me on how you think something like, I mean, I'm with you and I can get there. I want to say that. But a lot of people are probably like, what? Like how does that question lead to that?
Yeah. Each of us has the capacity to all right, here's a way to think about it. When Viktor Frankl was in Auschwitz and his wife had been killed, his parents had been killed. The only thing that was keeping him alive was that he had a dream that he was going to tell the horrors of what happened in Auschwitz to the world. And he imagined himself standing in front of packed lecture halls. And that was his private dream that kept him alive. The most famous passage from his book that has been read by over 100 million people came from a morning where one of his comrades was basically choosing to be killed by refusing to get up for work. And he basically tells the story how prisoners who would refuse to get up for work, it was basically they were asking to be killed because the guards would kill them that day if they refused to get up. He saw one of his comrades refusing to give up, and in his mind, he kind of privately mourned the death of one more friend. But as that was happening, he saw a third man walk up to that man who wasn't getting out of bed and gave that man a piece of bread from his pocket. And he says that he saw the moment that the man who was about to choose to die chose to get up because he was given that bread. And that Victor talked about there was a certain type of man in the camp who would save bread for those moments. And that's when he then says the last of the human freedoms is our ability to choose our attitude in any given situation.
Wow.
That capacity to give bread will save people's lives. And the truth is, there's, 400 million people have severe enough depression to have it be measured and quantified. But it's more than that. The people who are depressed are the people who are that man who's choosing not to get up. There's a huge existential weight on humanity right now that is crippling us.
Yeah.
It's because there are so many people who haven't been given a piece of bread. Because the thing is we have the same hardware, the same wetware that we had 100,000 years ago. We have evolved to be guided by elders who give us bread, who help us orient to the fact that everything that we love is impermanent, that pain happens, that animals eat other animals with their face, and that nature has that capacity to it. But the elders carry the stories and the myths, and the community, helps people anchor into the fact that we're here. We're here to continue what is happening into the next generation. And that we live in a culture where there's almost no elders. We live in a culture where the most powerful storytellers are corporations. And they're not trying to give out bread. They're trying to give out candy that addicts you to them. And the super hopeful thing is that we haven't ruined the game, and we only have a fraction of humanity caring, trying. Whereas like 90+% of the culture is either they have given up or they have arrested development as like a teenager. And that like we have the capacity, if we were to all adequately wake up and become adults, to turn this planet into a type 1 civilization. We have the capacity to bring the spirit of Gaia to other planets. We have the capacity to build solar machines around suns to harness. Like we have that physics to do that, to base, and that ultimately what is keeping us from being able to seize that currently is just a dredge of trauma.
Yeah. Yeah, we have the ability to erect the cathedrals of the future, the
100%.
technodelic cathedrals of the future. It's maybe something Terrence said, maybe not, maybe it's a combination.
Yeah.
Dude, yeah, and you started getting into what my follow-up question would be. And I want to say too, the Viktor Frankl thing also brings to mind that other famous quote of Jung where he said, of all the people I've talked to that come to me with depression over the age of like 30 or 35 or whatever it is, there's not a single one who didn't have essentially a spiritual sickness, a
Exactly.
kind of spiritual ache, that hunger that was not being fed or assuaged or acknowledged. And that's what that, of course, that bread is in your example, is this like nebulous spiritual satiety that we just try to dump possessions and dump achievement and ego games on top of, thinking, well, this'll do it, right? No, well, surely this will do it, right? And really, what would do it more than anything is just someone sitting you down, looking you in the eyes, and just being like, brother, sister, I fucking know. I know. And I'm struggling too, and I'm trying to figure it out too. And there's something going on here. There's something bigger going on here. And we're all figuring it out angstrom by angstrom in our own tiny, weird way. And that is like more, I mean, those moments of just brutal existential honesty are so absent, from like the way that people are living their lives, that it's like a almost like a minor epiphany when people really see you that way. Like we were talking before we started recording about how whatever that Gaelic phrase for hello is like essentially God is in you. And then I brought up how namaste is essentially the same thing, like I acknowledge the divinity in me acknowledges the divinity in you. And the fact that that's just the basic way that people used to greet one another, to a point where now it just shows up on Duolingo as this is how you say hello. Like,
Exactly.
and that's it. Like, man, like that is just shows what a poverty of soul and purpose that we all have right now.
And I think this goes back to Marie's quote at the beginning
Mhm.
of this
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, so I'm at the point in my life where I've talked about this shit enough, where I'm tired of hearing myself talk about it without doing things. And so for the
Right.
last year, really this year, I've started being more audacious. And it's like I'm trying to erect a personal mythology. And for the people who want to hear it, I share it. And it's like, fuck it.
Yeah. I mentioned you started to get into what my next question was going to be. And my next question is, okay, what is the world losing by people not taking essentially their individuation, their spiritual development really seriously? And the next question is, what could the world look like if those 400 million people, or whoever did start taking that seriously? I mean, because again, I have this sort of classical romanticization, I think, where I look at these cultures and just have this sense that they had something figured out. And I know that I do that, but at the same time, when you look at those temples, when you look at those pyramids, when you read Plato and Neoplatonists and, the Hermetic corpus or whatever, it really sounds like they had some shit figured out.
For
And it
sure.
seems like it's this exact type of wisdom that would lead to people
Yeah.
erecting massive temples and stuff like that.
Yeah. So
And megalithic structures that are all over the world that we just look at now and we're like, yeah, I don't know. you know,
yeah. So I think, what would the world look like if, for example, those 400 million people started to connect to their inner whisper? So I really like the Bill Plotkin's idea that your soul is not a psychological event, it's a ecological function. And
Mhm.
that your soul is connected intrinsically to the intelligence of Gaia Sophia. And that when you connect to your whisper, it will start to bring you into your ecological niche or niche. And my one caveat to Bill Plotkin's work is I don't think he had the capacity to see, or just didn't talk about the fact that our ecology now has a whole new dimension to it, and it's the shimmer. That is a part of our
Right.
ecology. And if you don't recognize that, then it's just fucking eating you. But I
Could
think that if those
could you
400, yeah,
could you zoom in on two things quick for people? Could you just give a real quick nutshell of Plotkin, who he is, and then
yeah,
also just restate what the shimmer is for people that don't know?
yeah. So Bill Plotkin, at least to me, is one of the most, I think, of the Jungians, if Jung were alive, he would be the most impressed by Plotkin's, or Plotkin's would be in the top five. Because to me, Jung would not be a Jungian, because Jung was like, I'm going in where it's dark, and I'm going to tell you guys what the fuck I find there. And he wouldn't have been okay just staying inside of, like a known structure.
Right.
Plotkins is the only Jungian that I'm aware of who like really mastered the depth psychology map and then left it and then went out into nature and basically started to apprentice with native shamans all across, like North and Central America.
Wow.
And he basically created a nature-based developmental map that is deeply inspired by Jung. Like all of his works, he gives credit to Jung. And his main book, The Journey into Soul Initiation, the case study throughout the whole book is Jung. And he actually taught me things about Jung that I didn't know through reading that book. So it's like proper hat tip to Jung, but it's an extension of Jung. It's like Jung meets like indigenous wisdom in the Americas. So I think he's one of my favorite writers and thinkers. So that's Plotkins. The shimmer is basically the totality of the digital world, and that it's a whole new dimension of existence. It's a new world that our cognition can go into. It has its own rules. It has its own creatures. It has its own evolutionary process. And it is fucking dominating this planet like a alien fungus hit us, about
well said.
20 years ago. And it's like the image I have in my mind is that the shimmer is a alien fungus that's on fire. And the flame is like ultraviolet. It's like it's the purples and the greens, and it's on fire, and it's in our pockets right now. It's fucking on our face, and that the task of our time is to, one, recognize the fact that there's this alien fungus that's on fire across the entire world, and two, we have to learn how to do alchemy with it. Because if we don't learn how to do alchemy with it, it's going to fucking eat us, and it's eating our children. But people who learn how to use it, like you have learned how to use it to the point where you can put out these transmissions. The thing about the shimmer is, without going too far down into this rabbit hole, because I could talk about it for hours, but I think that what's the right way to word this? The place where the fight is happening for the future is in the shimmer. And that if we can restore the mythos of a more beautiful world into the shimmer, we have a capacity to use it to help build it. But it's gotten to a sufficient momentum on this planet that if we don't restore it and regenerate it, it's going to destroy this planet. So that's the shimmer.
Yeah. Well summarized. I love the way you summarized Plotkin and also the shimmer, very well summarized. And now I've lost the thread of what you were going into, where I asked you to zoom out and reintroduce those, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't remember either, but people listening.
Well, you were starting to talk about Plotkin, and you were saying, I think he's in like the top 5.
The future. Yes. So like, what would the future look like if these 400 million people,
right.
Okay. So it would be, one, we would recognize the task of our time. We would recognize the horror story that's happening. Two, we would take responsibility for trying to steward the horror into something that could be hopeful. And what I see right now is because of the titanic power of the old structure, I don't know what the future will be, but I do think that there's basically there's like 4 major heroic archetypes that I can see right now that if people were to wake up, these are one of the 4 that you can commit to. There's earth-based warriors, and earth-based warriors would be like people who are creating homesteads, people who are trying to restore the land, who are, farming and doing things to regenerate the soil It's people who are trying to restore like rivers and forests and things like that.
Mhm.
Then there's earth-based dreamers. And earth-based dreamers are like the people who are genuinely called to like there's a person I know that I wish I could just take her and put you into your mind to give you as an archetype for what this type of person, but it's basically a person who is like a singer or a musician who also does vision quests and sweats and like really learns how to commune with the land and is trying to give the intelligence of the land to other people, and they're not interested in technology. But then there's the shimmer based warrior, which I think it's basically entrepreneurship and programmers and people who like to be a warrior in the shimmer is like you're basically training yourself to be in this ultravioletly on fire fungus network, because this is where all of the kids are. All of the kids, like 95% of the children in the world, are right now in the shimmer and they're on fire. And so the warrior archetype is like, you fucking grow up and learn how to be in here in a way where you can help the people who are stuck here either get out or help them turn into warriors too. And then the shimmer based dreamers are the people who are trying to put out the new myths, the new stories, the artists. You know, you probably won't like this title, but you would be like a shimmer based dreamer as like an archetype. You're trying to put out a new mythos or just like stories of hope and interest and beauty. And so I think that is currently as far into the future as I can see, because, you know, like knock on wood, but it does seem like we are in the process of a collapsing empire. And if you study the collapse of Rome, it didn't mean that everybody who lived in that area all just fucking died. But it does
Right.
mean that if you were a part of the Roman culture where you basically expected the central power to take care of you, you got fucked. You got destroyed because it collapsed and it didn't have its power.
Right.
But there's all these stories of all of these like generals of the legionnaires that could see that Rome was about to fall, and they basically learned how to band their community together around their vision. And there were towns in Gaul, for example, that prospered while Rome fell. And
Sure.
so I think, you know, we're in the process of a collapse that's kind of like a slow avalanche. And I don't know what it's going to look like, but I do think if people woke up and started to take radical responsibility for the horror story, you would choose one of those four archetypes. And the truth is, I think if you can bear it, you should choose one of the two archetypes of being in the shimmer, because that's where all of the kids are.
I also there's part of me, you know, when I think about this, what could the future look like? Something in me, man, wants to build an actual giant physical sacred structure.
Right. So
Like
I think that that's like step two. Like I think
mm,
step one is we have to learn how to be adults. You know, because like we like I think the first most pressing problem for us to really connect to is if the centralizing power structure dies, will my family die?
mhm,
And the truth is, almost everyone listening, the answer to that question currently is yes. That we don't
yeah,
have the capacity to survive a month without electricity if it was gone everywhere. You know, and it's like I think because I can feel that like fatherhood is super close for me. It's starting to like whisper like, hey, you are not competent in the ways that really matter if you're going to have a kid, you know?
yeah,
And then if we
yeah,
can stabilize that, yeah, I think step two is for sure start to build the structures. And the cool thing is, without sharing names, I know people who have adequately acquired the competence, because I'm at the age that I'm at. I'm 33. I There are
You're
people.
only 33?
Yeah.
Holy shit, dude. I thought you were older than that.
Yeah, I definitely look it. But there are people that I know who are like 15 years older than me who have won the game of like, you know, money and shit that are starting to wake up where they're financing like temples. Like they're trying to get physical structures up. And I'm glad that they're doing what they're doing. From my purview, the people who pay attention to me, what I see from my point of development is like, we got to stop being kids and we got to learn how to be adults. And a part of being an adult is like, do you know how to get water to your house if the electricity goes out? And it's not to be a prepper, it's to be a fucking competent adult. It's not
Right.
like, it's not building a bunker, because that's like, thinking that it's going to be a nuclear holocaust, which is very unlikely. What's more likely is that we just fucking that things start to get so expensive because of a bunch of reasons we don't need to get into, that it's going to be chaotic and disorderly. And yeah, so I'll
Yeah.
stop going down there.
Yeah, and I don't want to fearmonger. And I am a very optimistic person, but I think also you have to be a realist to some degree and just look at the fabric of civilization and what's going on. I mean, I'm talking from a high level, looking at what's going on geopolitically, the erosion of not only the influence of the US, but the hegemony of the US dollar, the fact that all of these countries, I mean, the petrodollar is no longer a thing. That's now gone. The idea of the US dollar being the currency at the backbone of the entire world economy, that influence is lessening and lessening on like a pretty much daily basis at this point. So now we're getting into the situation where you have these like few primary geopolitical fiefdoms of influence that are all vying for that power once again. And I want to believe that we're not going to resort to hot wars all the time, but it's hard to think that when you just look at the world right now. There's
Yeah.
so much shit popping off and it's getting increasingly scary. And no one wants to decrease the bluster and be like, we really need to stop this. And people who are, suggesting that we stop it are kind of looked at like, what are you talking about? We gotta protect our allies. And it's like, yeah, of course we do, but also shouldn't we be trying as hard as we possibly can to de-escalate? And maybe that's naive and I would have a different view if I was on the inside, but my God, man, because I want to especially believe what you said is right about the likelihood of a nuclear holocaust being very low, but it also has to be at kind of a high right now, at least for our
Yeah,
lifetimes.
and
It's
don't get me
like,
wrong. When I
yeah,
say nuclear holocaust, I actually mean nuclear holocaust in the sense of like one, like what the Cold War could have been, where it's like as
yeah,
soon as you launch yours, we're launching all of ours.
right,
And then in the course of 24 hours, 120 atomic weapons were dropped on the planet. That's what I'm talking about. I think that's super
yeah,
low. I think the chances of there being a nuclear bomb used in our lifetime is, more than 5%, which is still way too high.
yeah,
But the thing that I want to anchor to is, especially for people who are willing to listen for 2 hours to a podcast like this, it's not fear mongering. It's growing up. I'm not
mhm,
talking about you should, build a bunker. I'm talking about, do you know how to get water? Like, do
mhm,
you even have a plan for how to get water?
yeah,
Do you
right,
know anyone that you could go to get food from if the electrical grid went down? Like, I live in Texas. In the last couple of years, the grid has fucking gone down everywhere. And I've gotten to
yeah,
see firsthand how quickly things get fucking weird.
mhm,
And I'm haunted by my lack of practical competence. Like, I'm
right,
incredibly competent if there's a connection to the internet.
Right. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
also incredibly competent if people are fed well enough where they'll be willing to listen to me talk about abstract ideas.
Hmm.
I'm competent enough where it's my lifestyle and like it pays for my home.
Right.
But I am not competent if everyone around me is hungry and we don't know, and none of the stores are open.
Right.
And because I feel a kid is starting to come into my life, I feel the call to grow up more.
Yeah. Yeah. And this gets into that whole wrap that we've definitely had before, but I think is worth revisiting here, which is essentially the difference between olders and elders. And of course, this is one dimension of being competent and and full of wisdom and being an elder, physically being able to care for yourself and your loved ones. But why is that an important distinction? This just an older versus an elder, and what does an elder look like?
Yeah, so this actually comes like this idea of older and elder comes from Plotkin. I don't know if I told you that, but yeah, it comes from him.
Okay, I didn't know that actually.
Yeah. So, okay. In Plotkin's developmental map, a true adult is someone who knows their dharma. They know their craft that they are going to seek mastery in, and they specifically seek mastery in their craft to put soul into culture. So that's like, imagine your favorite artist or your favorite musician or like an activist or someone who spends their like from age like 38 to 60, like just fucking serving their medicine to culture as best they can. Only people who have done that can become elders. And an elder is basically once you have given your vitality and your genius to culture sufficiently for 20 or 30 years. And in Plotkin's map, once you have sufficiently established a renaissance in your domain, you've earned the right to be an elder. And an elder is like the function of the elder is to teach the children and the adolescents how to move through the stages of development. So the elders are the teachers. They're the wisdom carriers of how to help a human plant become a fully grown fucking tree. A older is simply someone who is over the age of 50. Most people who are over 50 are developmentally, according to Plotkin's map, they're still teenagers. Because what a teenager is interested in is status. So, how do my peers see me? And they're interested in what they want. So how do my peers see me and what do I want? Whereas an elder, like the function of an elder is to take your lived experience to help children and teenagers move through their initiatory stages. And so like how many of us? Some of us had grandparents. Like it's really interesting, but most of the deeply compassionate and wise people I know who seem like they're wise beyond their years, they had a really good relationship with a grandparent.
Hmm.
And that some of us got the gift of having a grandparent who really attuned to us as children. And even though they weren't elders, because they hadn't acquired, the full life cycle wisdom, they at least had the attachment disposition of trying to help children grow.
Right.
And it's like people who have experienced that have been like touched by a type of magic, where like there's an idea in attachment psychology that, it's one thing to be attuned to. And to be attuned to is when you can feel that you're being felt by a care provider. And that's deeply nourishing. And people who got that have a sense of belongingness in the world that, is our birthright, but that most people don't have. But then there's a different thing where it's the felt sense of being cherished. And the way that that's translated psychologically is it's the felt sense of a caregiver not only attuning to you, but being radically interested in how you see the world and what you are
Mm.
interested in. And like you can feel that they're cheering you on to become what you want to be.
Yeah.
And that's something that most of us haven't ever touched. But Freud has this great quote, and I've kind of remixed it a bit, but it's like he has some type of quote that's like, a boy whose mother loved him thinks that he can change the world. And like the way that I would remix it is like, a boy whose mother cherished him thinks he's fit to lead the world.
Hmm.
Like there's this intrinsic sense of what I am called to is valuable, you know? And if we had a culture of elders, like Plotkin believes that the task of our time is to try to get as many people who are stuck at stage 3 to move through stage 4 and to become stage 5. So stage 3 is early adolescence, and that's when we're trying to find our place in the status game and we're trying to fulfill our desires. Stage 4 is where you basically die to your competence that you acquired that got you status, and it's the journey into soul initiation, and that's what Jung did with the Red Book. And stage 5 is what Jung became after the Red Book, where he basically spent the rest of his life trying to translate the downloads he got in the Red Book into useful psychological language that people of his time could use.
Interesting.
That's stage 5. And he did that for fucking 25 plus years. And the fact that Jung spent the end of his life trying to teach as many apprentices as he possibly could, that would be a function of being an elder. You know, that he actually tried to be that. And like the thing about, so Plotkin thinks that if we can get just like 10% of people who are stuck at stage 3 into stage 5, we're going to have a fucking renaissance.
Yeah.
The virtuous feedback loop will be that anybody that we get to stage 5, anyone who gets to stage 5, as long as they don't prematurely die from some tragedy, they will naturally become elders. And the more elders we have, the more children and people stuck at stage 3 will have someone to help them through. And so it's like, as soon as we can get like 5% of people into the first stage of elderhood, we're going to figure it out.
Yeah, that's definitely a hopeful vision, and I hope that that's true. And I mean, you do bring up just by mentioning the Renaissance, you bring up a good point. In We do at least have some snapshots in history
Yeah.
about how this stuff can look. And again, I don't want to romanticize any specific time because it's not like that was a perfect era. There was all kinds of terrible shit also, I'm sure,
There's
that
no
occurred
utopias.
during that. Right. Yet at the same time, you have the reemergence of all of this ancient wisdom through people like Ficino, and because the powerful families, the Medicis and Borgias and like whatever, where they were all financing, like, translate the Hermetic wisdom, translate the Platonic corpus, all of this stuff. And then there's a huge advancement in medicine because they start, lifting. So it can happen. It can happen.
And the thing I want to highlight there is the Renaissance happened because finance was able to talk to the artists. And so when I talk about like the 4 archetypes, the shimmer based warriors are the people who like learn how to make $1 million, but learn how to do it in a way where you can actually feed a renaissance as opposed to just being more cancer on this fucking planet.
Right.
And there's so few people that I know who have, like a good heart, who are willing to cultivate the competence of making money. Because the Renaissance happened because finance was able to talk to the artists. We have plenty of people who have whimsical fucking ideas. We have very few people who have the competence to make $100 million and then to use it to help seed a renaissance, and it's like, as much as a part of me hates it, I can feel that like, I don't want to try to make $100 million, but the fact that I'm even saying that out loud now feels like, fuck, I don't know, but it feels like, that's a warrior path, because it's so easy to be corrupted, and so few people who have good hearts are willing to learn how to play that game. Like, dog, there are so many like spiritual bros who
Yeah.
talk about being warriors, but it's like almost none of them build things. They just talk
Yeah.
about it. And it's like,
Yeah. It's just a persona thing or aesthetic thing. Yeah. 100%.
you know, yeah, because
But
it feels like if you can grok what is happening on this planet, the mech suits to learn how to pilot, I think, are
yeah,
corporations.
for sure. Yeah. I mean, they're absolutely like one of the engines of power in being able to like manifest and disperse influence. And it's so tricky to find that balance of, like you said, not being a cancer on the planet.
Yep.
Like not literally, like, for example, I don't know, pumping more plastic and junk and like how you do that is it's definitely threading a needle. But one direction I want to make sure we go in before we finish this is we started talking about this during the pre-talk, and you brought up Jung again just a moment ago, and you brought up this documentary you just saw where
Yeah.
Mary Louise von Franz is asked about, and this fits in with what we're talking about too, because we're getting very close. We're in potentially some strange vision of the future, enigmatic vision of the future that
Yeah.
Jung may have had. So yeah, please share this because I didn't know this.
Yeah, so I just learned about this like I think 2.5 months ago. But there's a documentary, and I think it's called like The Heart of Matter or something. I'll find it and I'll send it to you, and you can link it in the show notes. But it's a documentary about Jung that I hadn't ever seen that has a bunch of like live interviews with people who were like directly related to Jung, like as students. And there's also a bunch of interview clips from Marie von Franz. And, you know, she carries like the resonance of Jung in her. And I love anytime I get to see her on camera because it just feels like there's mana coming through her. And at the end of this documentary, the interviewer asks Marie von Franz about a vision that Jung had a couple of days before he died. I didn't know that he had had a significant vision a few days before he died. When the interviewer asks Marie about this, she gets rattled. And I've never seen her rattled in an interview. And she like gets rattled and it's like, I'm not going to talk about that. And like the clip ends and then it comes back on and you can tell that the interviewer kind of like had like a combo with her to like bring her back in. And so she basically shares that that Jung had a dream that he felt was a vision, that there would be a cataclysm that would happen in 50 years. Jung died in 1961. So that would put it at 2011. And for me personally, the way that I interpret that is that if you study the effect of the shimmer on us, on what it's doing to kids, on what it's doing to teenagers, and what it's doing to adults, when you track the studies and the data, it really starts to get bad in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is just fucking like, what a coincidence, huh?
Right. Yeah. Because if you think about what was going on during that time, I think that's right. Essentially when Instagram is born, right around that time. And I remember that because I was living in Japan then and Instagram had like just come out. And I think that's probably one of the moments where it went from this sort of fascination and like thing people did to it really was the birth of social media and the digital world as a giant force in the world that
In 2010, I think is when smartphones, when the iPhone got a front facing camera.
Okay.
2010 is when Instagram was created. In 2011 is when I think 3G wireless internet started to take off.
That makes sense.
And it's also when Instagram got filters. And it's when Instagram, I think at the end of 2011 is when it got purchased by
Meta.
Yeah, by
Yeah.
Meta. And then in 2012, I think is when it went from like 10 million users to 90 million users. And
Wow.
Jonathan Haidt talks about 2011 is the crux point where the device that we used met high speed internet, met social media. And that is the beginning of where all of these charts about mental health and people fucking trying to kill themselves and all sorts of stuff starts to spike.
Hmm. Yeah, it's the cataclysm where everyone's head goes down 90 degrees, just
Yeah.
into that different dimension.
And like the thing
Um,
that I really want to emphasize is that the shimmer is it's incredibly mercurial in the sense
yes.
of if you don't know how to use it, the way that it's programmed by the most powerful corporations in history is to try to make you addicted to it. And if you don't know how to use it, it's going to fucking shred you. But everything good that has happened in my life, I can trace back to because I found something on the internet. Like,
Right.
the first podcast I ever heard, I was in college, and the first podcast I ever heard, like, really tried to connect to what this experience was like for me. Before I heard this podcast, I had never spoken to an adult male who cared about his life, who liked
Mm.
his life. Every single adult male that I'd ever met, they fucking hated their job and they did it because they had to. But the first podcast I heard two people talk and I could feel like, what the fuck is going on here? They like what they do.
Right.
That's possible. And then that sent me on a journey where I didn't know what an entrepreneur was. I grew up so poor and in a family so dominated by money that I thought you had to go get a degree to be able to sell something. And I didn't understand that you could just fucking start to make things and that you could basically just make things for people and they could give you money and that was legal. And like that
Right.
changed my fucking life. And then all of the people that I'm close to, I met through the internet, like you, for example.
Hmm.
Everything we've done at Fit for Service is because of how we've used the internet. Like thousands of people have had their lives changed, and I've looked them in the eye and I've seen the transformation, and that's because of the internet. Like it's both. It really is a schizophrenic renaissance.
For sure, dude. For sure. And a quick thing I want to say about, you know, deathbed visions or proclamations. By today's standards, that might seem like an out there idea, but who most people consider to be the most important philosopher of all time, Socrates, in the Phaedo, the Platonic dialogue that is just before his death and leading up to his death, he straight up brings up this trope that was believed in ancient Greece, apparently, that if one, some people just have what they called mantic abilities, like a mantis, right? Like the ability, a seer.
Wow, they called it a mantis?
Well, that like geomancy or like any of these like
Cool. Interesting.
work types of divination that uh suffix mancy is
Wow.
from mantis, like seer.
Wow.
Um
That's so interesting.
so there's already a bunch of times in the Platonic dialogues where he does somewhat kind of mantic things, and of course he talks to his daimon and stuff. Um but he says, I'm already something of a mantis, something of a seer. And then he goes on to make proclamations about the people who falsely accused him, because Socrates, spoiler alert for everybody, is put to death for ridiculous crimes and spurious claims about him. So he makes predictions about his accusers. He starts talking about this very esoteric. Well, I've heard that the true Earth is a dodecahedron, and this Earth that we're in is essentially, he starts talking about the body as being like a prison for the soul, and that the way we see the world is not the true world. So basically, he's bringing this trope up that as you get closer to death and
Okay.
you're peering to the other side, you're kind of seeing through the fabric a lot more than most people who are just walking around with their thumb up their ass running errands or whatever. Like you're very, very close to seeing like what you can't see when you're
Yeah.
a physical incarnated being. So this idea that Jung had a deathbed vision actually is very interesting to me, and I would definitely like to know more specifics about like whatever that was. Or is this, do you know if this is captured in a book anywhere, or is this just talked about
I'm
in
pretty sure
interview
she
context?
says in the interview that it was written down, but that it won't ever be shared.
Oh
I
wow,
think she
okay.
says that explicitly.
Hmm. It sounds like something Jung would do, doesn't it? I mean, he, dude, it's like,
Sure, for
say, like,
sure.
say what you will about, you know, thinking maybe people just really want the attention and like, yeah, he might act. He kept the Red Book a secret. He did not publish that thing.
Yeah.
He could have published it. He didn't publish it. And that, I mean, just
Yeah, I think his friends.
could just real quick, could you imagine making something like that? All that art, all that just transmissions from the underworld basically,
Yeah.
and not publish that thing, man.
I mean, and I think it's also like I think it's a confession of a type of consciousness that if people
Mhm.
grokked, it would change them. And it's like, imagine having the type of consciousness that the things that you are doing, you can feel, therefore, 4 generations from now.
Yeah.
And that you believe it so much that you put, 1,000 hours into making a piece of art that your generation won't see. I think that's being a fucking elder, capital E.
Yeah. Absolutely, brother. Well, here we are again, 2 hours just evaporated in a conversational flow state, in an exchange of psychic energy that permeated and created a tertiary conversational daimone that was batted back and forth between our daimones or something. I don't know.
Bro,
I lost it. I lost it.
you definitely have a stitch where you could be like a remix of Terrence McKenna, but just talking about things that you want to talk about because that's spot on.
Maybe I will. Or maybe I already am. I don't know.
Get them.
I've been, a quick note, I've been listening to, there's a lecture or a series of McKenna lectures called it's something about like on the Hermetic tradition or Hermeticism, exploring Hermeticism or something.
Cool.
And it's on Audible, but it's free on Spotify if you have a Spotify membership. And we're doing that for the Third Eye Drops Media Club. And it's just such a great compilation of McKenna riffs. It's just everything from, archaic revival and alchemy and Platonism and Hermeticism to a time he, decided he wanted to like take a bunch of LSD and smoke DMT at the same time, and
I've
then
heard that story.
and it's so funny. And then his neighbor comes home and just scares the bejesus out of him. Just there's so many good jams in there.
Yeah, he's got one story that has haunted me since I was in my early 20s, and it's that he says that he takes like 300 or 400 mics of LSD.
Mhm.
He starts to roll blunts the entire time it comes on until it peaks after about 3 or 4 hours. He then does DMT. No, I think then he starts to smoke all of the blunts. So he smokes all of the blunts he was able to roll in that come up. He starts to smoke them. And then after that, that's when he hits the DMT.
That's I don't need to go there. I don't need to go to that level.
What the fuck?
Yeah, he's a maniac.
You're gonna have to clip that. Sorry. Not like remove it, but I'm sure I just clipped the mic.
Oh no, actually I didn't really even hear it. But
cool.
Hey man, I love you.
I love you too.
Always love rapping with you.
Same.
And I always look forward to the next one.
There will be another one.